Hello, and welcome to the 6th lecture for English 421Y. In this video, I will focus on particular features of textual instructions, compare two examples, discuss the importance of developing instructions with content for different types of users, and finally end with a summary of important strategies for developing textual instructions. For the first part of Unit 2, you will be developing primarily textual instructions for a specific audience and context. Once you have determined the scenario, genre, and medium that you're going to be using, and also decide whether you are going to write instructions or procedures, all of this was covered in the previous lecture, then you should look for examples similar to the type of document you want to write, including but not limited to the ones that I posted on Blackboard. Once you graduate and get a job, looking for examples is an important habit to get into because different companies have their own notion of what documents should look like. And there are significant differences based on how and where the document is published. These differences can all be seen in the example of a recipe. A recipe is sort of the classic quintessential example of instructions because they are ubiquitous, because they are very easy to get wrong, even though they are so common, and because there are many different ways of doing it. So these differences can all be seen in the example of a recipe for a chocolate cake. Now, I've selected one example here. There's a number of different cake recipes and approaches to recipes, which will be what we do for activity 4, I believe, where I'll have you compare 6 different recipes for carrot cake. But for this lecture, I want to focus on chocolate cake, and now we're all hungry. So recipes can be both instructions and procedures, depending on what you're making. Baked goods tend to be more specific and require that things be done in a fixed order, which means that instructions are useful, whereas something like a salad might be looser. It doesn't matter what order you chop the vegetables in or mix up the salad dressing, so procedures might be more useful for something like a salad. Recipes can also be print or digital, and most digital recipes have a printable version so that people can choose which makes sense for them. Looking at this one, I've selected the print version already, and you can see it's pretty straightforward. So this example I have selected because it contains all the information you might want. At the top, it has the name of the recipe, 1 bowl chocolate cake. Then it has some simple information that gives you a sense of what the recipe is going to be like and how difficult and time-consuming it is going to be to make. Then you see the name of the author, a brief description, the ingredients list, and then the directions list. Usually, the ingredients are listed as a column or a table, and then the directions are usually listed in steps. You can see this is a really simple recipe that only has 3 steps. More complex recipes will tend to have more information, longer steps, more sub-steps, longer paragraphs, while recipes where the order is less important may not even use a numbered list. This one has 3 steps. Now, let's compare this recipe, which is relatively simple, to a slightly more complex recipe on the website Kitchen. Now, you can see just already this has a huge picture, whereas this one has a tiny picture. This one has multiple pictures, very delicious looking pictures. It has a lot of text. There's just a lot more on here. And if you notice, if you read through this, it's more description of how they developed the recipe, or why this recipe is different than other recipes, or why this recipe is the greatest chocolate cake you will have ever eaten ever. You can also see that it has similar information. You have the list of ingredients. You then have paragraphs rather than a numbered list explaining the actual steps. They also have a print recipe, which I won't click for now, but you can see the actual information of the recipe is right here, whereas all of this is just sort of icing on the cake, if you will forgive the pun. The difference between the two is one of audience and medium. A recipe website is all about providing information to an audience who is likely only there to get the recipe, perhaps even opening it while cooking. I open a recipe like this when I'm in the kitchen and I've got, sugar everywhere and the oven is going off and the timer is set and I just want the information really quickly. I get really frustrated when I'm in the kitchen cooking and I open a recipe like this and I have to, scroll down past 1,000 words of explanation, including like pictures of the author's child and, explanation of how this is her husband or his wife's favorite recipe. It's good, but again, the audience is slightly different. I'm more likely to read this kind of recipe when I'm trying to get a sense of how best to make a chocolate cake and I'm comparing different recipes. This has a lot of technique. It has a lot of explanation of what makes this recipe the best recipe. So if I've made multiple chocolate cakes and I want to sort of up my chocolate cake game, I might read a blog like this. Whereas if I just want to make a really quick, delicious chocolate cake, I'm going to use this one. Okay, so I describe, or I choose cake and baking as an example here because one of the readings that we're going to be doing for the activity that I mentioned earlier is called A Microcosm of Technical Writing in the Kitchen While Cooking a Banana Cream Pie. This is one of my all-time favorite readings because it does such a good job of illustrating one of the biggest challenges of writing technical instructions, the level of reader expertise. The author of this piece describes her attempt to make a banana cream pie for the first time and her frustrations with the kind of language common to recipes. For example, in response to the directions stir constantly until the mixture is bubbly, she writes, "How long do I have to stir this mixture? 5 minutes? 10 minutes? Bubbly means slightly boiling, aerated, or some other state. I stirred and stirred, but apparently not violently enough to get out all the clumps. I swear the mixture never got bubbly, but about 10 minutes into this step, the mixture became thick and creamy. Something I wasn't expecting because there's nothing in the instructions that indicated a dramatic change of state. As a novice who had never made this recipe before, key information was left unspecified because it assumed a certain level of background knowledge. The author's friend, who helped her make the pie, understood what vague instructions like prick the pie crust meant because she's already familiar with the terminology and methods of making this particular dessert. The author ends by suggesting that online instructions are superior to text instructions because they're not limited by space and thus allow you to add extra details and links pointing to additional pages in drop-down hotspots or through little information pop-ups. You're not restricted by space. Now, this is an important thing for you to consider because she's saying that traditional text instructions, print text instructions, are limited because there's only so much space, there's only so much information. With online instructions, instructions that are on websites, instructions that are in a PowerPoint presentation, or something along those lines, even primarily text instructions, when they're digital, you have a lot more space that you can use. You can send people to additional information. That means that you can write for different levels of audiences. You'll notice that, going back to this, they include a lot of information about frosting and other recipes for cake and other recipes for batter and that kind of thing. They point you toward other information. Whereas this one just gives it all to you directly. So again, what this is saying is that a more advanced user is more likely to be familiar with the recipe already and therefore won't need additional information. Whereas a more novice user would benefit from being told, hey, go to this link to get more information about basic recipes for making custard or whatever, and then come back here when you're done. Or go to this link to learn how to make a pie crust, and then come back here to proceed to the next step. As you write your document, think about the audiences that you are addressing and what might confuse or lose them. Okay, so next I want to move to Graves and Graves, Chapter 8. This is probably the most important reading of this entire project because it gives you an extremely detailed view of all of the different pieces of writing instructions. I talked about some in lecture number 5. I'll return to some more pieces for this reading in lecture 7. For now, I want to focus on the 7 strategies they introduce for making instructions and procedures easier to use. While all 7 are important, I want to point your attention to the first 4, and then I think it's number 6, that will be most valuable for the textual instructions that you are coming up with. First, on page 225, well, here's the 7. So I'm going to talk specifically about know your audience or user group, include an overview of the procedures, subdivide processes, write usable steps, and then design an effective page layout. So first is to know your audience or user group. Are they experts, novices, beginners? How much previous experience, knowledge, or training do they have on the topic? How do you create a document that can be accessed by more than one type of audience? The reason that I'm having you come up with a scenario is because you are saying in that scenario paragraph, my audience is a brand new intern at my company, or my audience is an experienced student at Purdue, or whatever. You are deciding what that scenario is, and you are kind of controlling reality. In most situations, you're probably going to have a mix of audiences, and you may not necessarily know who they are. But for the goal of this project, you can imagine a very specific audience and then decide what do they know, what do they not know, and what do you need to include or what do you not need to include. Next, include overview of the procedures. You need to provide an introduction or overview that helps users to gauge whether the document covers the topics they need, that gives an introduction of who the audience is, and sets up the structures and expectations of the document. In other words, how can you set the stage for what they should use your instructions or procedures for and how they should use them? Introductory material gives them the sort of foundation that allows them to then move into the next set to go deeper, to get into the steps of your instructions. As Graves and Graves write, users also appreciate being able to find a clear statement early on as to the level of background knowledge assumed in the instruction. If you clearly say, these instructions are designed for beginners. If you are an advanced user, you may want to skip to the end. Something like that really helps users understand, okay, this information is for me. Next, and perhaps one of the most important pieces of advice that Graves and Graves give, are to write usable steps. Now, this means organizing information based on steps in the process so that readers can clearly identify the most important information. For instance, in a recipe for a pie crust, the crust and the filling should be in separate paragraphs, even if one is 7 lines long and the other is only 1. This might throw off the paragraph structure, typical to academic writing, but it makes the document easier to navigate. This goes back to proximity. You want similar information to all be together. If you have multiple steps subdivided, which I'll talk about in a second, you want to make sure that you split the multiple steps off into separate parts of the document. That proximity of including all of the same information for one step together and then breaking a paragraph and then having the next step makes it easier to digest all of the information. Next is to subdivide processes. Instead of making the whole document a long paragraph or a list of 50 steps, use subheadings to group related steps. This is termed chunking by Essentials of Technical Communication and allows you to organize and subordinate the information into meaningful groups. So you can see here, this is an example of a set of instructions that have not been subdivided. There's 16 steps. And then here is an example of a set of instructions that have been subdivided. They take the same information They break equipment into a subheading with bullets. Then they have before you begin with 3 steps. They have set up the jack and loosen the lug nuts, and then they have 6 steps, then 5 steps. And you can see in each one, they are restarting their numbering so that you have step number 1 under this category, step number 1 under this category, rather than 16 steps. This is overwhelming. This takes a little bit longer to read, but it allows you to really break the information up into smaller sections. Finally, the last principle that they talk about is to design an effective page layout. Even for textual instructions, it's critical to think about the organization and layout of the entire document. Because instructions often contain a lot of complex information that must be completed in a specific order, many of the principles of page design that we discussed during Unit 1 while working on resumes and cover letters are also important here. This includes contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity, as well as including ample white space, using visual hierarchy so there's indentations and gaps in the margin to indicate where bullet points are, using strong topic sentences so that you begin with a clear description of all of the information that will be in a section rather than jumping right into action. And using vivid description, not using vague or general terms, but rather really describing what is happening. Graves and Graves include 2 examples on pages 228 and 229 that effectively illustrate the difference between an effective page layout and an ineffective page layout. So here, you can see the page layout is 3 paragraphs, one that is huge, one that is really small, and then one that is sort of in between. This is really hard to read because it requires you to read every single word. You can't skim this. You can't quickly navigate this. It includes no subheadings, no subdivisions, no numbered lists, no design elements that help you to quickly see the information. Contrast this with this, which is the same information, but in an effective page layout. You can see there's headings, there's numbers, there's subdivisions, there's contrast used to call out key information, there's visual hierarchy, an indentation here and here to indicate that this information is really important and to make it stand out more, bullet points, color even. Again, compare this to this. I don't know about you, but I find this second one to be so much easier to use. Everything is split up. There's good white space in between everything. There's white space on the left here. There's numbers. It's just much, much more user-friendly. Okay, so a few other useful tips that Graves and Graves Chapter 8 gives you include addressing the subject in the second person singular, saying you need to do this, you need to do that, or dropping the subject entirely and just saying calibrate the pH meter, not you should calibrate the pH meter. Using the imperative mood, which I just explained, which places an invisible you before verbs that are commands. So instead of saying you set the oven to 375 degrees or you calibrate the pH meter, just say set the oven to 375 degrees or calibrate the pH meter. Using bulleted lists when order does not matter and using numbered lists when order does matter. Inserting symbols or icons that are likely to be familiar or self-explanatory, such as if you have a lot of warnings or cautions, including a consistent warning symbol or something like that. And then creating your own visuals using a camera, screenshots, or something like Adobe Illustrator so that you have more control over the types of visuals that you're including in your textual instructions. Textual instructions can include visuals, but they need to be rather simple, few in number, and very, very important. That's it for today's lecture. Good luck as you develop your textual instructions.